Bound. Once, there was a young unicorn named Philomena awaiting her horn. All her life, she had been told about how horns were given to those of age, to those who played their part in the unicorn community, and to those who were good. She was of age, was a stellar member of the herd, and was generally viewed as good. But she was still waiting for her horn. One by one, her friends all got theirs and began taking on new herd responsibilities, leaving less time to spend with her. She continued to wait, growing more lonely and confused with each passing day. She was always up for helping the elders, caring for the foals, studying the principles and history of unicorndom, but somehow it was still not enough. There was nothing she could do to ease her confusion about her horn worthiness, for horn getting was sacred and not to be spoken about. In fact, Philomena had never been told in much detail how one gets a horn or what it feels like. All she knew was that when the magic deemed a young unicorn worthy, it granted them one, often during the night, and they were welcomed into the circle of adults the next morning. From then on, they would perform small magical duties for the good of the community for the rest of their life, which was the greatest purpose a unicorn could strive for. For so long she waited, until she was well past the age most get their horns. At this point, Philly wondered what was wrong with her that the magic had ignored her. When she sought advice from elder unicorns, she was told to reflect on herself, to see if there was any part of her yet unworthy of the magic's attention. And she had done so, stripping herself down mentally until the weight of her confusion and feelings of worthlessness was almost too much. One evening, she entered the forest that surrounded their protected pastures, as she had been doing often recently, retreating into her mind for answers. While wandering, she ran across a human man at his campsite, carving what looked like a unicorn horn out of a piece of deer antler. She knew that unicorns were revered by humans, and so did not fear him when he noticed her and spoke. "Why is a young horse out in the woods all alone?" "I am not a horse," she replied. "I am a unicorn." He glanced at her bare forehead, and she explained her situation briefly, omitting some details that would make her sound desperate. He thought for a moment and then said, "I can tell that this is causing you much heartache. I too have experienced feeling left out and separate from those I care about. I might be able to help you." "How so?" she asked. "I happen to be a wizard and artisan by trade. I could finish carving this decorative horn I'm working on and use some binding magic to attach it to your head." He gestured to his forehead. "Just until your real horn comes in. Perhaps then you would not feel so lonely." Months before, she would have been shocked and said no to such a thing, but the stares and whispers of her herdmates as they wondered why she was passed over by the magic had become too much to bear. She opted for more information. "How would it work?" she asked. He explained, "The best magic for binding things uses secrets. Once I use an initial dose of my magic to attach this to your skull, you must keep the secret of our meeting and all it has entailed. As long as you keep the secret, it will feed the magic that holds the horn in place." "Is there a catch?" "Not a catch exactly, but if you break your agreement to keep the secret, the horn will shatter, and you will find yourself more lonely than you ever were before. Not to mention the breaking of the horn would be incredibly painful." She thought for a moment. Could she live with herself for deceiving her family and friends? They seemed worried about her. Perhaps doing this would be a service to them too. With that thought in mind, Philomena agreed, reminding herself that it would be only a temporary measure, He completed the horn as they sat near the fire. Light conversation kept the silence of the night and her uncertainty at bay. When finished, he brought it to her and performed a series of rituals that bound it to her head. The man reminded her of the rules before she set off back to her home pasture. Quelling her uneasiness on the way back proved difficult, but she comforted herself with the thought that she might fit in better, that perhaps she would be back on track now. By the time she made it back, the morning sun was just peeking over the horizon. Upon seeing her face, the herd rejoiced and greeted her as a mature unicorn. They said things like, "Praise the magic," and "Finally, you made it." And although she appreciated their joy and inclusion of her, it did cause her stomach to twist a little. That evening, as was tradition, they had a celebration for her, eating their favorite flowers, playing games across the pasture, and giving speeches about her childhood and her new role as an adult. Soon they would begin teaching her the magical duties of warding, purifying water, and healing, and she realized this might be her downfall, as this fake horn granted her no real magic. In the following days of training, however, no one seemed to notice. In fact, since she pursued these tasks with the same vigor she had when trying to prove herself worthy of a horn, they praised her. She worried that eventually they would find her out if her real horn didn't come quickly, and the guilt of her lie weighed heavily upon her. Feeling a part of the group and rejoining her friends did, however, distract her from this worry a bit, and she enjoyed being free of the concern from her elders. She continued this way for a long time, the guilt of her deception and the joy of belonging alternating as she fulfilled her duties, magical and not, with no consequences. It did concern her, however, that no one questioned whether her horn was real or not. No one noticed that when she performed her magic, that nothing happened. Sure, an injured bird's wing healed after she touched it, but no faster than any other creature's would have if protected and cared for while its body had the chance to knit itself back together. Philomena began noticing other odd things she had never noticed before too, like how young unicorns would spend more time in the forest leading up to their horn appearance, and how no one talked or even hinted at how they got their horns, and how it almost seemed like more of a fearful silence about it than a sacred one. How strict everyone was about following the rules of their magic without question or nuance, even to the detriment of themselves and others. And that strange acceptance of her magical work, even though she knew she was not doing any real magic. She feared that perhaps all of her effort growing up, all of her denying her interests in favor of fulfilling her duties, had been for nothing. Clearly, it wasn't enough to get her a horn or allow her acceptance into the group, despite being taught to do so from a young age. All of these things threatened the moments of peace she felt about finding her niche in the adult herd community, and she nervously wondered about them more and more as time went on. One night, standing next to one of her friends who lay snoozing after another unicorn's coming-of-age ceremony, Philomena found herself unable to sleep. Her friend began mumbling about miscellaneous things, and Philly realized they were sleep-talking. Curiosity getting the better of her, Philomena asked her friend how they got their horn, hoping that maybe in the cloud of sleep the friend would answer honestly. Sure enough, they began to answer. "I was sad, and in the woods there was a huge..." Sudden snoring from the nearest unicorn stopped her friend's story as they were startled, but did not wake up. And it was a good thing it did, for as the friend had spoken, Philomena saw a small crack form in the base of their horn. It couldn't be, she thought to herself. Had her friend also gone to the wizard in the woods? Why else would their horn crack at the mention of a human in the woods? Who else in the herd knew about him? The thought made her shudder, but the more she sat with it, the more terrified she felt. She snuck away from the herd then and raced into the woods, seeking the wizard artisan. He was not difficult to find, and when she saw him, she barged into his camp, demanding he explain. Surprised, he set aside his potion work and asked what had happened. She explained a little, trying to be cautious, but when she mentioned her friend's cracking horn, his kindly expression shifted into a more unnerving one. He studied her, and smiled, and then told her plainly, happily even, "Ah, I see you have noticed. Unicorns do not exist, my dear." Confused, she retorted, "What are you talking about? There's one standing here before you." "Is there really?" he asked mockingly. "All I see is a horse with a fancy deer antler glued to her forehead by a human." She did not like how different his demeanor was now. "There's a whole herd of them just outside this forest. You can see for yourself." She was desperately pushing away, a terrible thought tickling the back of her mind. The man laughed and pulled back a burlap sheet on the ground near him, revealing at least a dozen antlers carved to look like unicorn horns in various stages of completion. "Shame is a powerful magic ingredient, little horse, and greed and malice is a powerful human motivator. Did you really think it would take so many rituals just to put a horn on your head? No. I need a constant supply of shame to channel into my potions and curses. Humans pay a pretty penny for such destructive magical things." "I don't understand," she said, taking a step back. "Clearly," he said with disgust. "Let me explain it more plainly. You and your entire family are nothing but ordinary horses, convinced that you are special because of your magical horns. When each of you begins to realize that just perhaps you are not worthy of such a gift, you find your way to me, and I, nice guy that I am, give you a horn, just until the real one comes in. However, there is no real one, and there never has been. All of your secret keeping and shame about not being good enough and about lying to those you love is channeled through your ridiculous horns, straight back to me like little magic wands, and I collect it and use it in destructive magical potions to sell to the cruel, greedy humans that inhabit the world beyond your sacred forest." Tears were rolling down her face now, as she felt the life and values that had been built for her become brittle and hollow. No, that can't be right." The man laughed again and began mentioning the names of her family and friends and what it was like when they got their horns, enjoying her horror as he spoke. Her mind numb and her body shaking, Philomena turned away from his gleeful face and started racing back to the herd to tell them, to free them from their bonds of shame, and to find support for her outrage. As she neared the inner edge of the forest, she could only barely see the others on a hill far away. Hearing the wizard gaining on her, she cried, "Your horns! I know the truth. None of them are real. We have been tricked." As she did so, the sound of her horn cracking pierced the silent night air, and then it shattered all the way down to where it was welded to her skull. Bloody and screaming in pain, she continued to run until she slammed into an invisible barrier at the tree line. Frantically, she tried to get to the herd, which she could barely see, and which had clearly not heard her call. One of her herdmates, who happened to be near the forest, awoke and sleepily tried to comprehend what they were seeing. As the fog of sleep cleared, their expression changed from shock to realization to terror, and then indecision and fear again. They looked back at the herd, and then back at her, and then past her into the woods, their stress evident as the whites of their eyes showed beneath tired lids. Refusing to look at her any longer, they nervously shook their head, almost looked back, and then turned away, walking back to the herd over the hill. Philomena banged against the barrier, screaming at them to wait, to help her, to tell the others, but her screaming only turned their walk into a gallop. The wizard had caught up now, and with a malicious grin reminded her of his earlier warning that she would be even more alone than she had been before. The realization settled upon her that she could no longer be with her herd. Her friend knew. They had understood what was happening, and still chose to return to their community, founded upon shame, and leave her, someone they had grown up with, alone and injured by the very thing that held the herd together. "Your friends will not break their promise to me like you did, little horse, and there is no way for you to find out if they do anyway." Her sobbing and shaking would not stop. "This is just as well," he said, pulling out a crystal and performing a spell that seemed to be siphoning and storing her anguish in the glowing stone. Enraged, but unable to control her crying, she stood up and began to run away from the wizard, away from the barrier. She could hear his increasing laughter behind her, slowly getting farther and farther away. And then she felt her body being compressed and stretched and magically contorted. She was no longer running, but was on the ground, writhing as she watched her hooves become human hands and feet, and felt the cool, early morning breeze on bare skin instead of fur. In a final act of cruelty, the wizard had turned her human. Now, even if she made it back into the pastures, her family and friends would never recognize her, and she had no knowledge of human society. Once again she was alone, only this time more completely. She spent the next hours crying in sadness, in anger, in resentment, in self-hatred. The wizard never came to find her, and neither did her herd. When she could cry no more tears, she carefully got up, brushed herself off, and put one human foot in front of the other, heading to the outer edge of the forest she had never seen before.